Welcome everyone to AURI Connect's Webinar Wednesday, part of AURI Connect's monthly online series featuring updates on the work that AURI is doing to foster long-term economic benefit for Minnesota through value-added agricultural products. I'm Dan Scogan, the AURI Director of Government and Industry Relations and your host on Webinar Wednesdays. The AURI Connect's program is hosted by the Agricultural Utilization Research Institute in Minnesota. This program aims to actively engage all participants in the food and ag industry to improve competitiveness of producers, businesses, and entrepreneurs through ongoing purposeful connection of resources and partners along the value chain and increased knowledge of opportunities, technologies, and trends. Remember, this event is being recorded and archived and can be found at auri.org. Remember that you will be muted during our presentation, but you can send us your questions written on the Q&A portal on your screen. Today, we will have a discussion about shelf life, food stability, food safety, packaging, and more. Joining that discussion today will be Jason Robinson and Lolly Okino. In his role as the Business Development Director of Food for the Agricultural Utilization Research Institute, Jason Robinson works with food clients to develop their businesses to further the value-added development of Minnesota's agricultural products. Prior to joining AURI, Jason spent 19 years in corporate research and development at a Fortune 500 food manufacturer as a product and process developer across a number of food technologies, including ready-to-eat cereals, salty snacks, frozen dough, ice cream, tortillas, taco shells, and snack bars for the US, Canada, and other global businesses in both the conventional and natural product sectors. Jason was recognized as a collaborative technical business leader and later led R&D teams in snack bars, fruit snacks, salty snacks, snack bar packaging, and meat snacks. Jason also has served as Chief Technical Officer of a small entrepreneurial business built within the confines of the large CPG, which has shaped his passion and his desires. Lolly Okino is a scientist of food and nutrition and leads the food program area for AURI. She conducts and manages applied research and technical assistance for food clients and works with the project team to facilitate the successful execution and development of new products and initiatives. Prior to joining AURI, Okino held scientist roles with both large consumer packaged goods companies and a small contract research and development company. Her experiences include product development and ingredient applications, design and analysis of experiments, and sensory and shelf life testing. This will support product formulation and optimization. Working in varying environments over the previous 20+ years, Lolly served multiple customers with individual needs. So with that, Jason, let's turn it over to you. Welcome to Webinar Wednesday.
Warm introduction, Dan. We're excited to be here to talk a little bit about shelf life for food products, particularly as it relates to scaling food businesses. So let's start real quickly with just understanding that shelf life is something of great importance as businesses start to scale from local to regional and even to national distribution, where decisions on package type, product formulation, and production process all have an impact. Defining and determining that shelf life is a common challenge. This webinar is a companion to a PDF guidebook, the Food Product Shelf Life Guide for Scaling Food Businesses, hosted on our website at auri.org/guides. This webinar is meant to highlight concepts from that guide. The guide itself was built with funding from AURI's Ag Innovation Partnership Program, together with a partner, Clutch Performance. The AIP program provides funding to partners to improve the base knowledge of Minnesota's innovation ecosystem. In other words, to transform unknown unknowns into known unknowns, or to catalyze activity in specific topic areas. Today, we'll discuss the basics of shelf life, including what it is, what it isn't, and what impacts it. We'll also touch on code dating, product modes of failure, product design considerations, how to measure shelf life, and finish up with a couple Minnesota local examples. Let's start with a basic definition of a shelf life. Simply put, the definition of a product shelf life is the time period during which a food manufacturer expects the product to deliver the desired experience to the end consumer. This experience is not something that is regulated or predefined by an outside entity or a third party. Rather, it is defined by the food business and those people that are closest to the food product themselves. Typically, the product experience is reflected in terms of taste and texture, but may also indicate other factors like odor or aroma, color, nutritional content, or product performance. Food businesses, as well as many consumers, often confuse shelf life as the amount of time a product is safe to eat. With the exception of a few highly perishable food products, this is not the case. Food businesses should not use the time frame indicated by a product's shelf life as a substitute for building food safety into the product design. Rather, the product design, such as ingredients or storage temperature, for example, the manufacturing process, and the package structure all should protect against the introduction of foodborne pathogens. Let's start by talking about code dates. With the exception of baby formula, code dating language on food products are not federally regulated. This contributes to varying language appearing on packages, many of which you can see here, and I'm sure many of which you've experienced yourselves. Predictably, this can lead to confusion at both the consumer level as well as at a retailer and even buyer level. So in 2017, the Food Marketing Institute and the Grocery Manufacturers Association issued voluntary guidance to the industry focused on streamlining the code dating language to two phrases. The first being use by or use or freeze by. This applies to perishable products and indicates the date by which the food should be consumed or discarded. Best if used by, which is very common for shelf-stable products, indicates to the consumer that after that specified date, the product may not taste or perform as expected, but it is still consumable. So it's not a food safety issue when that code date expires on a best if used by statement. In addition to the commonly visible date code, most food packages also carry a manufacturing code date. We're not going to discuss this in detail, but it is typically a series of letters and numbers that is somewhat undecipherable. What it does is it helps the brand owner track the manufacturing date, time, production location, and even production line. This information is a critical component of every food manufacturer's food safety and traceability plan. Now, I'll turn it over to Lolly to do a deep dive on a concept of major importance to understanding shelf life, that being the mode of failure. Lolly, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Jason. So as Jason mentioned, mode of failure is a really important concept to understand when we're talking about shelf life, because shelf life is not equal for all products. So the way that we're defining mode of failure is the first product attribute that deteriorates beyond a brand or owner's quality expectation to define the shelf life endpoint. So there are different ways that a product can deteriorate. Quality is something that we think about, and sensory is one of the first things that people can think about and relate to as it relates to shelf life. So in this case, sensory attributes could include appearance, aroma, flavor, and the texture of a product. So for example, for appearance, if the product separates, the appearance, that would be a failure. If in flavor, you could lose intensity of a flavor, or a product could develop off flavors, and this could define the end of a shelf life. And then for texture, you could have something lose crispness or become stale, and that could define the end of shelf life in that case. Another important mode of failure to consider is nutrition. The level of nutrients in a product can change over time and would be important to monitor, especially if you're using a claim. A lab analysis might be necessary to assess these changes and could be very important in determining shelf life, since nutrients can degrade over time. Like here in this example, you see vitamin C, and they're saying that it's 120% of the RDI, or the recommended daily value. And if you're claiming that, you need to ensure that that level of vitamin C is the same at the end of the shelf life as it was when the product was fresh. Another example that is kind of the opposite situation would be something like a raw kombucha, where the product gets bottled, but it can continue to ferment in the bottle, and that would produce more alcohol. If the alcohol exceeds 0.5%, it can no longer be defined as a food, and in that case, that would be the end of the shelf life for the kombucha. Another mode of failure that some people might not think about is product performance. Here, one of the best examples is in raw dough products, and it could also apply to even dry mixes, where the leavening agents, which could be yeast or a chemical leavening like baking powder, lose potency over time. And then if that happens when the consumer makes the product, it's not going to rise to the level that it should, and that's going to be a failure in the consumer's eyes. So having, you need to ensure that that active ingredient is going to be to the same level at the end of shelf life as, again, that it was fresh. And then a final mode of failure that is important to think about is microbiological spoilage. This is typically going to happen in a product that's higher in moisture. An example of a microbiological spoilage could be mold growth, as you can see here on a piece of bread. It's typically not a food safety issue, but it's definitely going to be an issue with the consumer and a product failure. Fresh fruits or some types of other sweet baked goods are tend to be most prone to this kind of spoilage. But other items like refrigerated dips could ferment by lactic acid bacteria. And in these cases, typically a microbiological shelf life evaluation would be required, and that would be monitoring the microbiological counts over time to determine the shelf life. If spoilage is an issue in a product, there are different things that you can do to help extend the shelf life. For example, you could add preservatives to something like a fresh tortilla. Something like a potassium sorbate would help extend the shelf life. And then next we have a table here just to give you some examples of common modes of failure and timeframes by temperature state. You can find this also in our guide. It's a little bit, we have more examples there, but we just wanted to give you an idea of whether a product is stored at ambient, which means room temperature conditions, or frozen or refrigerated. There are different things that can happen that would be considered a mode of failure. And again, remember that that's the first thing, the first attribute that fails. So you can see, for example, in ambient, the amount of water in the product is going to have a big impact on the shelf life, since it affects whether chemical reactions will occur or whether microorganisms will grow, as we had discussed before. For example, in products with really low amount of moisture or something that we call water activity, like crackers, the mode of failure might be loss of crispness, since they would tend to pick up moisture. However, because they're so low in water or water activity, microbiological spoilage isn't a concern. But then again, something like a fresh baked good that has a little bit more moisture in it, the opposite could happen, where it would lose moisture, and then that would cause it to the texture to become tougher, for example. And then you can see that if you look at refrigerated products, like, again, something like a dip, microbiological spoilage could be an issue. In frozen goods, of something that's very common, like in ice cream, would be ice crystal growth or freezer burn. Now we're going to move on to, whoops, sorry, to talk about external factors that can impact a food product's shelf life. And these are very important to consider. And when a product is exposed to external factors like what we're depicting here, temperature, oxygen, moisture, and light, the changes can occur because of chemical and physical reactions. While the changes don't necessarily create a food safety issue, they definitely can affect the product experience for the consumer, which can greatly impact their satisfaction and desire to purchase again. So food manufacturers have to make decisions on how to minimize these factors while also considering the impact on the cost of goods, like the packaging, manufacturing, or logistics. So I'm just going to touch on each one of these briefly. So temperature, generally, as we had seen in the table before, products are designed for distribution at a specific temperature state, whether it be ambient, refrigerated, or frozen. And temperature abuse, which would mean prolonged deviation from the desired temperature state, can cause quality issues. An example here could be a raw dough product. As we had talked about before, if a refrigerated roll or a rising crust frozen pizza is subject to temperature fluctuations, it might lose some of that leavening. And then when it's cooked by the consumer, it's not going to meet the expectations. And then the next element would be oxygen. So oxygen can migrate through the packaging of a sealed food product. And as oxygen migrates into a product, it may accelerate the development of off flavors, often described as soapy or paint-like, due to what we call oxidative rancidity. Another important factor, and we touched on this a little already, but moisture. Similar to oxygen, moisture can migrate in and out of a package. For a crisp product, additional moisture might result in a stale or soggy texture. And conversely, if moisture migrates out of a product, the item dehydrates, and that might cause it to, for example, have a hard or tough texture. Another consideration is when ingredients with different moisture levels are mixed together. In this case, the moisture is going to tend to migrate from the more moist item to the drier item. So a good example of this is raisins in a granola. The raisins are going to tend to lose moisture to the drier grain, and that's going to cause issues for both of the elements. The raisins would become tough and the grain would lose crispness. And then finally, light. Exposure to light will over time accelerate changes in the appearance of a product, and such as color bleaching or browning. For example, if you can imagine a berry fruit beverage that's nice and bright red color in a clear bottle exposed to light, that might lose color intensity or get brown. In addition to that, light exposure can also accelerate reactions that can cause off flavors. Again, oxidative rancidity, which can cause rancid flavors. For example, nuts or potato chips that are packaged in a clear package, this reaction would happen more quickly. And now we're going to talk about some different product design that you want to consider when you're thinking about shelf life. I'll just touch on a few of these, but again, moisture content or the water activity of a product is very important. As higher moisture products might be perishable, meaning that they can be subject to microbiological spoilage. So of course, that's going to have a shorter shelf life than something that has a lower moisture. Something that's more what we call intermediate moisture, that could be something like a chewy cookie or something like a fig Newton. If that loses moisture, it's going to become more dry or crumbly. Now, the ingredients that you choose can have a big impact on the shelf life. And that would include the choice of ingredients, the age of the ingredients, and the quality of ingredients that you use. So an example here would be, say you decide to put whole grain flour in your baked good. Well, the whole grain flour is going to be higher in fat. And that means that it could be subject to oxidation again, which is going to cause off flavors. Whereas if you had used a refined flour that was lower in fat, that is not going to happen as quickly. If you use ingredients that aren't fresh at the time that you make a product, for example, say you use almonds that are already rancid in your granola bar, that's going to make your whole bar taste rancid, and it's going to negatively impact your shelf life. And you can see a few of the other examples here, and I'm going to move on to processing considerations for shelf life. So again, I'll touch on a few of these, but the first one I wanted to touch on is heat processing of your product. If you are canning or pasteurizing or hot filling your product in some way, you're likely going to extend the shelf life quite a bit because they're not going to support microbiological growth in that case. And when you process them, you're also in a way accelerating some of the flavor and texture changes. For example, if you can think about a canned tomatoes, they're typically a little bit darker and softer in texture. So that means that changes in those attributes over time are going to be less significant. Another easy example that people can relate to would be blanching. If you have a product where you're incorporating fruits or vegetables and you blanch them ahead of time, that can inactivate enzymes, and enzymes are something that if are in the product can accelerate reactions, and so by blanching you can stabilize those and help to extend the shelf life. Another important processing consideration would be temperature variations. So this is really important at the time of packaging. If you say you package a baked good when it's still warm, that can cause condensation on the surface, and that condensation in turn could result in yeast or mold growth, and that's going to obviously shorten or end your shelf life if that happens. So in general, products that are less processed or higher in moisture are probably going to be perishable and need to be stored in refrigeration temperatures and have shorter shelf lives than shelf-stable or frozen products. For example, think about something like a refrigerated salsa versus a shelf-stable salsa that has been acidified and hot-filled. In this case, the choice of process dramatically impacts the shelf life and, in that case, the food safety as well. Now I'm going to turn it back over to Jason, and he's going to talk about some packaging considerations as it relates to shelf life.
Great. Thank you, Lolly. So even with careful ingredient selection and the appropriate processing, as Lolly has already talked through, a product's packaging will also impact shelf life. Selecting a package with inadequate moisture and oxygen barrier properties, or if the package is just not sealed well, will shorten your shelf life. For example, let's compare the Kraft paper pouch on the left to the multi-layer plastic pouch on the right. This is an example we see all the time with small food businesses that are very concerned about the impact of plastic on the environment. So while there may be a desire to use the perceived more environmentally friendly paper pouch, those type of pouches typically provide poor barriers against moisture and oxygen versus the multi-layer plastic pouch on the right. This means that the product inside will be less well protected from moisture and oxygen in the outside air, typically resulting in shorter shelf lives with the modes of failure that Lolly has talked through, and potentially leading to higher levels of food waste with those shorter shelf lives. As an FYI, the barrier properties of concern for a package are typically referred to as the water vapor transmission rate, or WVTR, and the oxygen transmission rate, or OTR. Smaller numbers are better in this case. This is a complex topic, and we've only briefly touched on that on a surface level, so we're certainly open to talking through it in more detail. But if you're interested in learning more, AURI also has a guidebook that we produced approximately 3 years ago called the Packaging Guide for Scaling Food Businesses, or the associated webinar. The guide is available at auri.org/guides, and the webinar is available in the history section of our Webinar Wednesday site, right on auri.org. And I'd certainly encourage you to both watch the webinar and to download the guide for more information. Now, what you've all been waiting for: how do we actually estimate or measure shelf life? To be blunt, there is no reference table or analysis equipment that can be used to easily define a product's shelf life. Rather, shelf life is determined in real time using the actual product and packaging by the brand owner while following a defined evaluation protocol. So let's walk through that a little bit. We use a comparative testing methodology at regular intervals of time throughout your proposed shelf life. At each time point, you'll compare a reference sample, which is typically held at what we would call time zero, or held quote unquote fresh, by freezing the product. Compare that versus the aged sample at room temperature, and then score using the difference scale shown here for all sensory attributes, including taste, texture, aroma, and appearance. This scale is what we call a difference scale, and it really is dependent upon how different the product is, the aged product is from the reference sample, so that we can always go back and repeat that testing if necessary. But using a defined scale sets a standard for all testers. Each brand owner must determine at which point on the scale the product no longer meets their quality expectations, going back to the definition of shelf life, and then use the total time elapsed from the date of manufacture to the point at which the product reaches that difference score as the shelf life. AURI has a sample test protocol with instructions available at auri.org/guides, and our scientists are always available for a consult. However, knowing that shelf life testing, as described, could take a year or even longer to get those real-time results does not mean a food manufacturer needs to wait until completion of that test in order to launch a product. Oftentimes, a solid estimate can be made by doing a competitive audit or talking to a retail store category manager or department manager on what those category norms might be. Additionally, food manufacturers will often try to shortcut this approach by using an accelerated testing methodology. In accelerated shelf life testing, the test product is stored at higher temperature or other abusive conditions, such as higher humidity or exposure to light, in order to accelerate the degradation reactions that Lolly discussed. However, this approach is not a substitute to doing a real-time shelf life study under typical conditions. Rather, it's a useful tool to evaluate product or processing changes when you have an established baseline of shelf life against which to test that product. So if you don't have that original baseline, an accelerated shelf life test will not give you a good example of what your test or what your shelf life should be, because it is a comparison to a baseline, assuming that you already have those baseline measurements on your product in the finished package that you're using. Moving on, I'd just like to touch on a couple of additional topics that we did not have time to cover today. The first is around distribution and storage. While a food manufacturer can carefully choose ingredients, processing, and packaging to mitigate the impacts of oxygen, moisture, and other external factors, the manufacturer cannot fully control these factors throughout the distribution chain. For example, storage and distribution in Florida, where it's hot and humid, versus Arizona, where it's dry and hot, versus Minnesota, where we see extreme seasonal changes, will expose the product to significantly different environmental conditions, possibly even within the same truckload. Additionally, there are business model implications to consider. The most important of which is if you are unsure about your shelf life, you should always start conservatively at launch, meaning that it's easier to communicate to a retailer that you're starting with a shorter shelf life and extend it at a later time than it is to shorten your shelf life while your product is already in market. This would involve a change at both the retailer level and potentially even at the distributor level in order to adjust that change. Whereas extending a shelf life just gives them more time to work with the product as you go through the supply chain. So what we'd like to do now is just finish up our commentary and our prepared content by sharing a couple AURI client examples from here in Minnesota. These examples are real AURI clients, but their identity has been scrubbed for privacy concerns. The intent of these examples is really to reinforce the primary message of today's webinar, which is the importance of clearly identifying the primary mode of failure for a food product. This way, you can design an effective strategy to extend your shelf life at the lowest cost and/or producer impact. So this first example is an example of a tzatziki sauce that was experiencing separation. The shelf life problem described was really focused on separation between the water and dairy phases, which you can kind of see in the picture on the right. This mode of failure is called syneresis in the food science world. The client came to AURI with a thought that they wanted to add preservatives to avoid this separation. However, in this particular case, a preservative strategy would not mitigate the primary mode of failure, the separation, but could result in an off flavor or unnecessary ingredient costs. So, without understanding that primary mode of failure and how to address it, you could put yourself in a position where you try a solution that doesn't have any impact on the problem you're trying to solve. In other words, you need to choose the right tool for the job at hand. Lolly will cover the next client example.
Okay, thanks, Jason. So here's another example, as Jason suggested. So in this case, a client assumed that they needed to add antioxidants, which is something that would help prevent oxidation or rancid flavors to their product to extend the shelf life. They had a cookie that is a soft, chewy cookie. AURI took a look at this and recognized that actually the primary mode of failure was not rancidity or off flavor development from exposure to oxygen, but instead it was the hardening of the cookie over time and causing it to get crumbly. So this problem would not be addressed by the addition of antioxidants. Instead, we had recommended that they improve the package barrier properties to slow down the loss of moisture on the cookie. And this extended the shelf life as desired to keep it nice, soft, and chewy. The client still added an antioxidant to potentially combat flavor loss as a secondary mode of failure, but that was not necessary to impact the primary mode of failure, again, which was that loss of moisture causing the crumbly texture. So these, as Jason suggested, were two kind of real world examples where understanding the mode of failure is very important. And with that, we are going to turn it over for any questions that you might have, and I'm going to turn it back to Dan to lead that portion.
Okay, Lolly, Jason, thanks for the great information. This is your opportunity to ask the experts a little bit now. So while Jason and Lolly continue to stay with us, if you have a question about shelf life and I guess how to do it better, this is the time to get those questions in, and we ask that you put those in the Q&A portal, and we'll ask them. One thing that I think, Jason, during part of your presentation, you were talking about heating a product to make it more stable. Is that high heat, short amount of time, medium heat, longer periods of time, or does that vary depending on what you're working with?
I think that, what you're getting at is really dependent upon the type of product and the goal of what you're trying to do. For instance, there's a process in the dairy industry that dairy producers know well called high temperature short time. And what that is, it's an HTST approach that is focused on decreasing the microorganisms in a dairy product. And it's really a food safety approach so that you can have the product go through distribution without seeing significant growth in the finished product, while you're also refrigerating it to prevent growth. Now, while it's fundamentally focused on food safety, the reality is that it also extends the shelf life of the particular product. And in the case of dairy milk, fluid milk, for instance, high temperature short time is an approach to try and preserve both the flavor of the milk as well as drop that microbiological load so that you can get 3 to 4 weeks of shelf life on that fluid milk product. Raw milk, which does not experience that type of processing, would typically have a much, much shorter shelf life and would be very, very prone to creating and forcing individuals into a foodborne illness just because of the presence of the pre-existing organisms. Lolly, anything that you would add?
No, I think Dan, there's many different types of heat processes, and it's dependent upon the product. So in some cases, I talked a little bit about something called what we call hot fill, acidified and hot filled. That's a really kind of a regulated process that producers can use to create what we call shelf stable. And that just means that the product is safe to store on the shelf. While it addresses food safety, it also extends the shelf life, because by doing that process, you create a product that is stable and won't be able to, microbes won't be able to grow in the product.
Got a question here from one of our viewers today. I make a pesto that I sell frozen at stores. It can also be sold refrigerated for up to 5 weeks. I did the extensive testing you have talked about. I'm curious though about making it shelf stable, but I hesitate to even go that way, as every shelf stable pesto I have ever tried tastes terrible to me. Is there any way to make it shelf stable and retain that fresh taste?
Well, I can take a first crack at I mean, that is something that's difficult, because the known processes for creating a shelf stable product are really what we've talked about. Looking at the acid level or the pH, and then heating the product and keeping the heat while you fill it. There are other processes, something called high pressure pasteurization, that some companies use, but typically that kind of process is used more to extend a refrigerated shelf life than it is to create a shelf stable product. It is really tough. I mean, there might be a way through something that we call the hurdle approach in food science. We call it a hurdle approach, where you use multiple factors that can help with the food safety. For example, the level of salt in the product, the level of acid in the product, maybe a mild heating step. I mean, there might be multiple things you could do, but taking that kind of approach takes quite a bit of experience, expertise, and probably a lot of testing to get to the place where you would be comfortable having a shelf stable. So there really is no easy answer, unfortunately. I'll let Jason comment as well.
Well, my only add as it relates to a pesto sauce is the challenge typically becomes pestos are a combination of herbs and fresh ingredients together with oil. And once that product is packaged, you're creating an environment that we call anaerobic, which means without oxygen or very low oxygen. And the challenge with fresh ingredients that you would put in a pesto oftentimes is that they bring in microorganisms. And if those aren't treated appropriately, specific microorganisms can grow very, very well in an anaerobic environment. In particular, the organism of concern is Clostridium botulinum, which produces the botulinum toxin leading to botulism. And so anytime an all oil environment is a consideration, we have to be very, very careful about the temperature at which that product is stored if you're using fresh ingredients that haven't been treated according to traditional food safety measures. So pesto and oil and infused oils tend to be challenging products to get to shelf stable for that reason. And remember, food safety is really an effort to control the spread of foodborne illness. And so that's the reason for the extensive regulations. Refrigeration and freezing are what we would call control factors. They're not necessarily going to be something that eliminates the growth, but controls them reasonably, which is why you still have a shelf life associated with a refrigerated product. It slows down the potential growth.
We produce a kippered beef strip that seems to salt out very quickly in a vacuum package. This product is kept refrigerated throughout the process and display for sale. It happens in less than 30 days. I'm wondering what I should be looking at to correct the problem. I'd like to make the product shelf stable. Lolly, you're nodding. You seem to understand.
Well, I'll take a stab at it. Although I want to say that we have a meat innovation specialist on staff now here at AURI. His name is Clay Newton, and we can certainly connect you with him. He has expertise in this area. But I would say that regarding making it shelf stable, the first consideration for a product like that is what we call water activity. And we touched on this during the webinar. We didn't get too deep into the definition, but it has to do with the available moisture in the product. And when it comes to a product like that, the water activity has to be below a level of 0.85. So water activity goes from 0 being a dry product with no water at all up to 1, which would be water. So for food safety reasons, in order for a product to be shelf stable, it has to be less than 0.85. So there are strategies that you can employ to get your beef strip. It would be using different things that are soluble in water, and they effectively hold on to the water, like salt, and there's other things that we call humectants. So there are things that you can look at to create a shelf stable product. And I think for today, it's probably too complex to discuss, but like I said, I would recommend that you can contact Jason or myself, and we can get you in touch with Clay.
Very good. Is there a way to add liquid flavorings like vanilla to a cake mix?
There is a way. I mean, if you have a lower level of flavor, you can do something that we call it plating. So basically what you can do is you can take the liquid and slowly add it onto something like the sugar. And then you basically, like I said, it's called plating. So you're basically getting the vanilla onto the dry mix evenly, or the sugar evenly. And then that component, the sugar, can in turn then be mixed into the dry mix. It's probably not ideal if you're dealing with a dry mix. It's best to look for a dry vanilla, and you can certainly find those. They're available. And again, we could help direct you to some companies that sell that kind of product if you're interested.
Yeah, I'll just reinforce what Lolly said. In the case of vanilla, I actually have in my pantry today a bottle of vanilla powder that delivers a very high quality vanilla experience. But you do have to watch because it will degrade over time, which is the whole point of the shelf life discussion that we're having today. Those flavors are very volatile, and traditional vanilla flavor is very volatile, which means that as the ingredient ages and is subjected to heat, even at room temperature, you will start to see that volatile component that gives the vanilla its characterizing flavor diminish over time. The last thing that I'll add here is what you're describing is the reason that the food scientist exists. I'll put a plug in for Lolly, who has tremendous expertise in designing food products with the right ingredient solutions and matching the needs to the ingredient selection. And with AURI's vast network of connections, it's highly likely we could connect you with the right organization to get you what you need to solve your challenging food science problem.
Nice. Party here is wondering if you could briefly expand on how you decide whether or not to work with an entrepreneur or a company and what that relationship can look like.
Happy to talk about that. AURI is a nonprofit organization that's largely funded by the state of Minnesota to foster long-term economic impact through value-added agriculture. You can really think of us as a technical consultancy that offers our services at a subsidized level for small businesses. So for AURI in particular, our food team is really focused on providing food science and consumer science expertise at an affordable rate. To work with us, what we have to do is connect you to the organization, and typically I am the first point of contact for the organization for food businesses. And then we'll talk through your challenges and your needs. And oftentimes what we'll see is we might be able to answer that question in our first discussion without even the need to set up a project. However, should you be interested in working with AURI formally, what you'll do is fill out an application for support that really highlights how you're supporting and using Minnesota agricultural products. And from there, we'll work through and build out a very specific work plan or scope of work that is subsidized by the state depending upon your revenue size and location. As long as you're in Minnesota, you can see that cost sharing come into effect. And oftentimes we'll just see that the level of support we can provide falls within our range of acceptable products. And if we don't necessarily have the expertise that you're looking for, we're happy to connect you to the right expertise through our vast network of connections. So if you're interested, reach out and we'd be happy to have that initial conversation with you to talk through your specific challenges.
And I think it's important to note that those relationships depend on what needs to be done.
Exactly.
I think, Jason, I've heard you talk about sometimes the client is asking the wrong question. Correct. Or has the wrong impression of what has to happen. And sometimes our expertise is to point you in the right direction.
Absolutely, Dan. I think that's a great point to raise. Because of our industry experience, we oftentimes use that experience to be able to clarify the problem to be solved. And sometimes that problem to be solved isn't what you think it might be. Just look at the examples that Lolly and I walked through from a shelf life point of view, whether it's separation of a dairy and water phase or a hardening, crumbling cookie. What you think might be the solution to the problem that you have might not actually be solving the problem. So defining that problem is of utmost importance. And we put significant effort into making sure that we're solving the right problem for you.
Are there resources out there for entrepreneurs to use to educate their consumers about why, for instance, they have to use plastic instead of paper in packaging, or why they need to use a certain preservative or change the recipe a little bit or something? Is there resources out there that help the entrepreneur tell that story?
The short answer is yes. They're not difficult to find, but you have to get them from a trusted source. Oftentimes what we say is that consumer education is one of the most difficult things to actually manage when you're trying to dispute something that might be a closely held belief, such as the reason why you might need a preservative in a product, or such as that green color is meant to be there. It's not an indication of mold, which is certainly a challenge we've seen in the past. So visual cues can be a challenge. But if it's a closely held consumer belief, trying to change that perception is very difficult to manage. I would recommend that rather than trying to identify the resources that you need, it's best to talk to somebody with deep expertise in the industry to make sure that you're getting the right information to answer the questions of concern. Lolly, anything you would add to that?
No, I think you're right, Jason. And I think just being ready to, understanding yourself, to understand it very well, the reasons why you're doing something is the first step. So like the example Jason gave with the packaging, if you're out, say you're selling your product at farmers markets or you're sampling, you can talk to your customers and explain why you made that choice. So I guess the first step is just doing your research and understanding it yourself. But it's something that the food industry in general is struggling with as far as misconceptions on the consumer part. There's just various ingredients that they don't think fits a clean label. It's their perception whether or not it's true, and it's just something that we need to continue ongoing education.
Right. And regulations can oftentimes challenge that as well.
Exactly.
If you look at an ingredient label, for instance, there's no difference between sodium bicarbonate and baking soda. And yet one sounds a lot worse than the other to a consumer. So that type of education is certainly something that can help you to better create an authentic connection with your consumer. So the last thing I'll say here is just transparency to the consumer and authenticity to the consumer is of critical importance to building that trust for your particular brand.
Lolly, what's in blue cheese salad dressing that makes it shelf stable?
Well, it's probably the way that it's processed. So if it's processed, if it's pasteurized, that could make the dressing shelf stable. Or many salad dressings do add preservatives as well. So it could be that. I guess I'd have to see the specific example, but it's probably something in the process or in the ingredients that made it shelf stable.
Accelerated shelf life testing is valid for shelf stable products. What about refrigerated or frozen items? Is there an accelerated option for those?
I can touch briefly on the refrigerated, and maybe I'll let Jason cover the frozen, but it's difficult, honestly. And the way that I've approached it in the past is basically, using the so for a refrigerated product, the reference would be stored kind of under perfect conditions, which means say 38 degrees Fahrenheit with no fluctuation in temperature. And then the accelerated product would be somewhat kind of abusive conditions. So it would maybe be 50 degrees, or you might select too elevated temperatures. There's not really a perfect way to do it when it comes to refrigerated, because it's hard to even have, sometimes like a reference product is difficult because a product that's refrigerated, typically it might not freeze well, so you might not be able to rely on a frozen condition for a reference. You might need to make it up fresh, or you evaluate the product fresh and you kind of basically are doing it by memory. So those are some of the approaches that I've taken. Is, like I said, you can do something like a 50-degree, but it's not perfect, because when you get to a temperature like that, you can get other things that are happening that might not happen if it was stored under the refrigerated condition. And that's true, honestly, for any accelerated, even if it's an ambient product. If you accelerate, sometimes some reactions happen that wouldn't have happened at room temperature. So you have to be really careful about that and kind of know your product and the conditions.
Jason, is the same with frozen?
Frozen is very similar. Typically what we'll see in frozen products, because freezing more or less pauses time, if you will, for many attributes, oftentimes what we'll see with frozen products is that you can monitor, rather than flavor degradation or texture change. Oftentimes what you'll see is there's some form of preparation associated with the frozen product. Unless it's ice cream, where you can see ice crystal growth as the primary mode of failure. But that's where we'll see something like product performance, such as, does this bread dough that I've had frozen for 3 months bake up to as high of a volume as I would expect it to? And as you lose the power of your leavening or your yeast over time, that's one way to manage it and to explore shelf life for frozen products. But like Lally said, it can really be dependent upon the type of product. And it's good to have a solid consult with not necessarily shelf life experts, but at least with food scientists who understand the concept and can help you determine the right approach. Sorry, Dan, but one last thing I wanted to just reinforce about accelerated shelf life for room temperature products. While it is an approach that can be used, I just want to reinforce that accelerated shelf life testing is not recommended as the first approach to monitoring your shelf life when you have a new product to the world, because accelerated shelf life testing is built on a correlation with products that have gone through the real-time shelf life test. So while it might give you an indication, if you don't have a correlation to your product in your packaging, that correlation might not be accurate and will give you a potentially wrong conclusion to your shelf life tests.
If something is pasteurized, does that have to be listed on the label?
No, you don't have to list that kind of processing. I do notice that it is listed sometimes, and I think maybe sometimes companies think it's an advantage to say something was pasteurized, but it's not a requirement.
We're near the end of our time, so I'm going to give you guys the last word. Some of what I learned today is somewhat intimidating because you do want to put out a safe, healthy, tasteful food product. So Jason, and I'll start with you, what's your advice to the entrepreneur, the food entrepreneur who has what they think is the next big thing, but they want to make sure it gets out there in the form that they're enjoying it?
Make sure you talk to a professional early, because before you put it out into the marketplace, you may recognize that for food safety concerns, you may have to adjust the product. And that adjustment is handled much better up front than it is before you expand distribution. So feel free to reach out. AURI is a great source of information, and we would love to be able to provide you that perspective right from the beginning.
Lolly, what's your advice?
Yeah, I agree. And yeah, I just want to emphasize that food safety always comes first. That should be your first consideration. Once you know that your product is food safe, then you can start thinking about shelf life. And I would just recommend, like I was discussing before, make sure you do your homework. If you have a product in a certain category, go out there and look at other products in the category. You can get some good ideas or good feel for what the shelf life is on those products and what might be a mode of failure, and start early on your shelf life. So as you're developing your product, start storing some and evaluating it over time. If you do that early on, then you'll be ahead of the game when it comes to determining the shelf life.
Very good. That concludes AURI Connect's Webinar Wednesday for today. We do want to thank our presenters, and AURI Connect's Webinar Wednesday is presented by the Agricultural Utilization Research Institute of Minnesota. AURI's mission is to foster long-term economic benefit for Minnesota through value-added agricultural products and processes. We're interested in your feedback, so please respond when we send you our event evaluations. And remember, for more information on today's program or any of the work that AURI is involved in, you can go to auri.org. Now, October 12th, AURI Connect's Webinar Wednesday will be back with a program on Oktoberfest and a celebration of Minnesota's brewing industry. But you can always learn more about other work that AURI is involved with by going online at auri.org. And then we're looking forward to having you join us again in October for another AURI Connects Webinar Wednesday. Before I send you on your way today, I have another announcement. AURI is pleased to announce the launch of a new podcast for anyone interested in Minnesota agriculture. This Friday, the Ag Innovation News podcast will release its first episode with a preview episode with AURI's Executive Director, Shannon Schlecht. This will be followed up next Wednesday with a full interview with Minnesota Department of Agriculture Commissioner Tom Peterson. Future episodes of the Ag Innovation News podcast will highlight individuals and organizations dedicated to making a positive impact on Minnesota agriculture, and will be covering a variety of topics ranging from value-added ag to the benefits of emerging crops to the ecosystem overviews. The Ag Innovation News podcast will be available on all major podcast platforms starting this Friday. And we hope you will join AURI as we delve into all the important ag-related topics of the day. Thank you.